JP, welcome to the Philosophy for the People podcast.
All right. Thanks for having me on, Pat.
Yeah, this should be a delight because, as we were saying behind scenes, we're interested in a lot of the same stuff, and I really enjoy your content, especially on Substack. You just have that style where you can tell you're sort of a natural teacher. You grasp things at a deep level, but you have the ability to communicate them simply. I always admire that. You definitely have that quality, so I appreciate what you're doing, and
Thanks
yeah,
so much.
it's good to chat with you for sure.
Yeah. Yeah, that's really kind. I appreciate that. Thank you.
So before we get into it, because there's a lot of stuff we're interested in that's the same stuff: free will, natural theology,
Yeah.
morality, all the typical philosopher business, right? Give us a little bit about your history, because you strike me as somebody who has very much been philosophically on the move, and who is
Yeah.
kind of still on the move. And I don't mean that like in a
Yeah.
way that
Yeah.
we're always trying to refine our thoughts, of course, but somebody who's had some kind of maybe some big swings in the positions you hold. Is that right? You give us a little background.
Yeah, for sure. Um, yeah, so I think I became interested in broadly philosophical questions in my teens, my late teens especially. So I played a lot of tennis growing up, and as the tennis phase of my life started to kind of wind down, I leaned more into pursuing philosophical questions, but in a pretty unstructured way before college. So I don't think I didn't really know what philosophy was until I went to college. But majored in philosophy at Texas Christian University. During my undergrad time, I was for the most part until maybe my senior year, and this is quite a long time ago. I I was some kind of physicalist, I suppose. I think I concluded like in my late teens that if you were going to be an intellectually serious person, you had to be a naturalist, and probably if you were a naturalist, you had to be a physicalist.
Mm-hmm.
And so that was sort of my setting during my undergrad days. What started to shift a little bit, even towards the end of my undergrad career, was that I became very committed to moral realism,
Yeah.
and became increasingly convinced that you can't really make sense of objective morality on a straightforwardly physicalist or perhaps even naturalist ontology.
Mm-hmm.
So I started reading a lot of Derek Parfit. In fact, I've got a Parfit book in
Yeah,
front
yeah,
of
yeah,
me
for
here. So
sure.
he was kind of my my step out of he guided me out of just sort of unreflective naturalism. Um,
Mm-hmm.
and then I then went to grad school at UT Austin to think a lot, to think harder about ethics and about free will. I became very obsessed with the free will question.
Yeah.
I was very lucky to study under Galen Strawson, who was my kind of my free will hero at the time.
Yep.
We
Yep.
had very
Mm-hmm.
similar views, and I guess maybe still do. We can get into that to some
Yeah.
extent.
I hope to.
And then I think midway through grad school, there was another shift that started, which is after I started teaching my own classes. So to put a date on it, this was 2016.
Mm-hmm.
So I earned my master's degree in 2016. Started teaching my own classes. I started teaching some philosophy of religion. And, like I had always been interested in the really big questions, the big worldview questions. Those had been less front and center earlier in my philosophical career. But when I started teaching philosophy of religion, I slowly started to think that, actually some of these arguments are pretty good.
Yeah.
I thought that they
They
were
don't
all
all succumb to Dawkins, right?
yeah,
Yeah.
no, that's right. That's right. And we can talk about that too. I mean,
Sure.
I read the New Atheists, when I was in my
Mm-hmm.
teens, so those people had an influence. But yeah, no, when I was actually trying to do justice to these arguments, I realized that really, I think I had rejected kind of straw man versions of them
Right.
when I was younger. And so then that opened up a new phase of inquiry that lasted several more years,
Mm-hmm.
started really kind of rethinking the God question,
Mm-hmm.
and then that continued after my PhD into just trying to make a living teaching philosophy, to the point that I did end up finally concluding that I could make a better case for a theistic worldview than a non-theistic worldview.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So the general trajectory, to kind of recap that, was away from sort of a hardcore naturalist materialism, increasingly towards non-naturalism, and then eventually, finally, towards some kind of perhaps tentative theism.
Yeah, yeah, it's tentative and weak leanings, and yeah, it's always good
Right, which is, yeah,
to.
and I would say it's become less tentative and less weak leaning in
Yeah.
recent times,
Hmm.
probably the last couple of years. But I'm happy to flesh that out in detail. Yeah,
Yeah, no, it's always good to just,
yeah,
just state where you're at, right? And it's those, I poke fun, but those ways of describing oneself are helpful, right? And what brand or flavor of theism, as you know, and as listeners know, there's many flavors of theism, like Haagen-Dazs ice cream out there. Is there any that strikes you as more formidable, more robust than others?
yeah. Classical theism, broadly construed, I think,
Love to
because
hear it. Love to
yeah,
hear it.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. I thought friendly audience here, but but yeah, because
Mhm.
for reasons that we can potentially get into, I think that
Mhm.
there are considerations pointing in the direction of some kind of fundamental existent that is that's perfect, and I think that entails perfect simplicity, and so that sounds a lot
Right.
like classical
Mhm.
theism as people describe it. So
Yeah, yeah. I mean, to me, if we just dive in there, a lot of times people will say, "Well, you don't really need simplicity, for aseity or ontological independence. You just need perfection." But I've never seen a way of spelling out perfection that doesn't land you in simplicity, or that doesn't require simplicity, right? So, I mean, classical theists hold the traditional view that a perfection is just to be thoroughly complete or thoroughly made, right? That's what it is. So, like, perfection is explained in terms of being or actuality, right? So something that's absolutely perfect would be something that's free of all restrictions and limitations, that is purely actual. So, like, you know, for the classical theist and classical metaphysician, perfection is downstream, theoretically, of simplicity. It's simplicity and actuality that's doing the work. And I don't know, like, I haven't seen a good model or proposal of perfection that can exclude simplicity without, I think, making nonsense of itself. I don't know how much you've explored that, or if you have any thoughts on that, but I just felt like just throwing something out there. Yeah.
I mean, I'm disposed to agree with all of that. I think that you probably know a good bit more about the details of models of God than I do, but yeah, I mean the idea of something that's perfectly simple, I think, is the only way that you avoid, like, further questions like why this, and why is this thing only so powerful, and so on, right?
Mhm.
So yeah, any kind of, like, never have been tempted by pantheism, or a limited conception of God like you get from some of the deists, or
Mhm.
or people who say that God is contingent. So I'm like in this broad camp of classical theism, and probably don't have super strong opinions about like the details of how to cash out God on classical theism yet, but that may be
Yeah.
coming.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Well, yeah, we can circle back to that if we want.
yeah, yeah.
I want to go back to the free will thing, but I want to start a
Cool.
little
Yeah,
bit broad, because here's something that I think is similar between us and our trajectory. Is like I was inclined towards a naturalism.
yeah,
Um, and I had my teenage influences as well. Not all of them at first were professional philosophers. One big one that struck me early on was Mark Twain. I was a big Mark Twain fan. And he has, I don't know if you've read this, people can find online. I recommend reading it because it's a really interesting essay. It's called What is Man? And it's essentially like his way of kind of like arguing for determinism in a kind of poetic,
hmm,
funny Mark Twain way. I remember, like, man, that just captured my brain when that happened. As the free will question kind of captures everybody's brain.
yeah,
That was just
yeah,
sort of
yeah.
my introduction. And, like, at the time, oh yeah, it just seemed so utterly convincing, right? Like, inescapable, right? But over time, um, I guess just certain features of experience, and you said this about moral realism, that was true for me. Just seems so obvious and undeniable to me, right?
Mm,
So much more true, if we could use that term, than any of these other theories that had trouble accommodating them. That I just sort of found my position to be one where I if I could, like, I just had to find a theory that could accommodate these features of reality, if that makes sense. Call them. I think I'm comfortable calling them Morian facts. I think they are, right. They're so phenomenologically forceful, right? Our own agency, the moral domain, um, that if a theory can't accommodate them, then like so much worse for the theory. And that's kind of what I'm hearing, kind of from your experience too, is that you
Yes.
maybe it was more realism, maybe it was free will, maybe it was both. For me, it was a whole lot of a whole lot of things, right? It wasn't just one thing.
Yeah.
Free will was one of those. More realism was another. Let's go into the free will thing.
Sure.
I actually haven't read a whole lot of your uh position on this. There's a lot here. So yeah, I take it you're a libertarian, right? Broadly construed. Is that right?
Well, I don't know. These days, maybe some kind of libertarian. I've warmed to libertarianism uh, over time. But if we
Mhm.
go back to my undergrad self and graduate school self, I was just a thoroughgoing no free will person.
Oh, okay, so you were in
Yeah,
that. So you weren't like
yeah.
I've got to make sense of free will because it's a thing. You were actually in the determinist camp.
Yeah, that's right. No,
Yeah. Okay. Got it. Yeah.
yeah, yeah. So I was,
Yeah. I always resisted it. Like I was just like I felt the force of the arguments, but I was like,
mhm.
there's got to be something wrong with this, right? Yeah.
Yeah. I haven't read that essay by Twain, although I'll go look it up. He's a very fun writer, but
Hmm.
my reasons were probably not what it sounds like his were. I don't think I was ever, or at least not for very long, a convinced determinist. I know people use these terms differently, but in the sense of thinking that causal determinism is true.
Right.
So that wasn't why I didn't think that there was free will. Instead, I thought my old advisor, and I still I'm not totally sure where we disagree, but the Galen Strawson is largely correct about this. So he gives an argument that uh, dates way back in the history of philosophy. Who knows who came up with it first? First, Schopenhauer gave it. I think Nietzsche gave it. But
Hmm.
the idea is that free will requires a kind of ultimate self-determination that seems to not maybe even be logically possible. Um, Certainly isn't well, that really has nothing to do with the determinism indeterminism debate. So that was my kind of starting point, at least.
That was your point starting out. Okay, cool. All right, so let's maybe we should, it'd be helpful just for the listeners because we're throwing out some terms here, and this is
Sure. Yeah.
philosophy for the people to just kind of map the terrain a little bit,
Yeah.
right? So the libertarian, of course, and there are different libertarian positions, hold that we are. It's been a while since I thought about this clearly. That we are in some sense like a true and genuine causal initiative. I think we could say, right? Like history doesn't just pass through us in a real sense, right? And to me, there seems to be, I think, three things that the libertarian wants to hold. One is that there's real genuine causal initiation. We can maybe clarify that a little bit, right? There is some form of indeterminism, right? And this is more controversial, but I think I would want to go there. Is there's some aspect of inherent unpredictability, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
I think those are three things that the libertarian will want to affirm, and whether you're a source code libertarian or something else, I think those are fairly common, right? Um, then the determinist camp, and I'll let you clean this up, right, comes in different varieties of soft and hard, but essentially that like whatever it is about us or motives and volitions are sort of determined by prior factors that are also sufficient for them, right? Build on that. How would you clarify that, or maybe build out the train a little bit
That
more?
sounds
Yeah.
yeah. So no. So that sounds pretty good to me. To offer maybe like a slightly different framing, basically in the terms that you set out there. If we're thinking of free will as a kind of problem, it is generally cast like in terms of determinism, where on the one hand you get a threat that's posed by determinism, which is that it seems to entail, if true, that we can never do otherwise, at least in the common sense, right?
Mhm.
Whatever happens next had to happen next, given what came before, and it seems like that kind of that conflicts with the common sense notion of free will, whatever that is. So that's the
Yeah.
threat from determinism, and then from indeterminism, the classic worry is that, well, all that supplies us with is some randomness,
Randomness, the old luck
right?
objection, right? Yeah.
Yeah. So, and it seems like whatever free will is, it's not a matter of uh, it's not going to be consistent with causal necessity, but it's also not going to be consistent with just like randomly doing stuff. And then if you think that determinism and indeterminism sort of exhaust the
Yeah.
conceptual landscape, then you're left thinking, oh, no free will. So that's at
Mhm.
least one way in. Now, as you said, libertarians want to say that no, you can have indeterminacy that doesn't give
It's
you
not
randomness.
randomness, right?
Yeah,
Yeah, they're
yeah, that's right.
contraries, but not contradictories, right? Those
Right,
terms.
so
Yeah.
that the agent still has some kind of proper control over what he or she does.
Hmm.
And then compatibilists say that no, actually, if you think about the concept of free will and the concept of determinism hard enough, you'll see that they're actually compatible with one another after
Hmm.
all. Yeah, yeah,
Yeah, I've never seen that, but maybe I haven't thought hard enough.
yeah. I think that I've come to think that there is a real compatibilist insight here. I think that
Hmm.
I like to think in terms of varieties of freedom, and
Hmm.
that there are varieties of freedom that are consistent with determinism.
Right.
I'm not really convinced at all that any of those varieties amount to what the ordinary person means by free will.
That's
So
a really good point. That's a really good point. So just like quickly, like this is why I love the classical tradition, because there's always like three understandings of freedom broadly, right? There's freedom from coercion, call that circumstantial freedom. Yeah, compatibilists for sure, right? That you get to do what you want to do or something like that, right?
yeah,
You're not put in chains. Then there's the virtue ethic notion of freedom for excellence, right? Freedom from kind of these internal constraints of vice or whatever, or something like that, right? But that's not, doesn't seem like freedom of the will or freedom of choice, right? And then there's this other, the freedom that I think is what you're gesturing at. This is the one we really care about in the free will question. And that is the freedom of choice. And that's not just the freedom to do what you want, right? I mean, because like one thought experiments, what if somebody programmed you to want this or that, right? I mean,
yeah, yeah, yeah,
traditionally it was understood to be the ability to end deliberation and close down upon like between competing desires, between competing wants, right? That are themselves not inherently determinative of us, right? It's the will that is the active power that like
yeah.
bestows that final magical quality that actually makes something to be or appear the best. Like that's the, do you think that's right? Like that's the free will thing that we're most interested in.
I think that's right, and
Mhm.
maybe at this point I should also invoke a closely related concept, which is moral responsibility. So
Yeah.
it's ordinarily thought that free will is tied to moral responsibility, such that if you have free will, then you're morally responsible for your actions, which means that you're subject, to praise, blame, punishment, reward, and so forth, in virtue of what you do. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So you said you're warming to libertarianism. So discuss that a little bit. What's moving you? Or do you still consider yourself a determinist, or like where are you now, and what are you moving towards? That's my question. Yeah. Mhm.
Yeah. Okay. So, don't consider myself a determinist because I mean, I think my view about this is that we just don't know whether determinism is true.
Mm.
That's so. I think that the physics so far just kind of under determines the question, right? Like we don't know based on current physics whether determinism is true. I do think that probably whether determinism is true can be settled by physics, and we said in the past was that I was some kind of hard incompatibilist because I just thought that free will is incompatible both with determinism and with indeterminism. So just like the
Hmm.
determinism question doesn't really enter in, and why? Because you're not ultimately the cause of the way you are, and you would have to be the ultimate cause of the way that you are in order to have free will. That was the old thought, right? Okay, now in the last couple of years, I guess I have started to shift a bit on this, and the primary reason is that basically my thoughts about the nature of agency has started to shift. So
Mm-hmm.
I'm quite convinced that that I exist. what I mean by that.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
You've
Yeah,
made
no,
more
thank you.
progress than a lot of philosophers.
Yeah. No, it took me like over a decade.
We've got there.
Where what I mean by that is that I think I'm a substance. How to
Right. Yeah.
cash that out
Right.
exactly, I
Rock
don't
and
know, but
roll. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
yeah, maybe even like a soul.
Yeah.
And I
Yeah.
think that as a substance, I have causal powers. I can initiate causal chains and be the explanation of certain actions
Right. Mm-hmm.
that occur. Okay, and so
Yeah.
you can attribute certain of my actions to me. Why did I lift up my coffee mug? Well, because I decided to. That's the explanation. So
Yeah.
I'm comfortable now with some kind of agent causalism.
Yes. Yeah.
Um, Now, does that secure this ultimate moral responsibility thing? I'm not sure.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's why I have a kind of I have a sort of weird intermediate position where, in some
Yeah. Yeah.
sense, yeah, I believe in free agency, but I'm not yet sure that
It's
free
sufficient for
agency
moral responsibility.
secures
Yeah. Yeah.
secures ultimate
Yeah.
moral responsibility. And if it doesn't secure ultimate moral responsibility, maybe it doesn't really secure the thing free will, if free will is connected to moral
I see where you're
responsibility. So
coming
sorry,
from.
that's a
Yeah.
philosopher's
No,
answer, but
no,
yeah,
that's
like
those are
that's
those are helpful distinctions because these are clearly logically distinct, right? One could hold exactly that. You could hold that, yeah, no, we are genuine, like primary substances with this suite of causal powers, and one of these causal powers relates to the space of reasons and the ability to end deliberation. That's just a traditional understanding of with the will, just as traditionally understood to be the rational appetite, right?
yeah.
And a lot of the debate, would, if that's what you hold, then you might even say it's an immaterial aspect of us. So like whatever the physics is almost irrelevant to that question, right?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
So that's one route. But then you could also say, but there's other reasons to think that even if that's the case, um, it's still not adequate for maybe not even just moral responsibility, but culpability, right?
Mm-hmm.
And why is that? Maybe, I don't know, maybe there's just too much ignorance or something, right? Um, that you could still be a genuine initiator and not entirely determined by history, but for culpability or more responsibility, there has to be some sort of adequate knowledge or something like that, right? That's not my position
Yeah.
personally. I think we do have free will, and I think it is sufficient for those positions, but I can see how one could take one but not the other, right?
Yeah,
For
that's
sure.
right. And
Mm-hmm.
and the Galen Strawson worry is that you've got to have a kind of responsibility for the way that you are in certain mental respects that just seems to not be conceptually possible, because what he thinks is that would require that you be a causa sui, that you be a cause of yourself, and that's not, you can't do that. Certainly no
Mm-hmm.
finite being can be the cause of oneself, right?
Yeah,
Um,
not like all the way through, for
Not
sure.
all the way. Yeah, not all the way through. Yeah, that's right. That's right.
Yeah, but certainly I think any proponent of libertarianism would think, yeah, there's a lot of stuff that's just sort of given to us, right? Including
Right.
our inherited characteristics, blah blah blah, right? But there is a real sort of shaping that goes on through the choices we make, right? Yeah.
Yeah,
Now
that's
whether
right.
that's enough to alleviate his concerns, I'm not entirely sure. Just kind of
Yeah,
acknowledging that,
because
right? Yeah, nobody can be the full out cause of themselves entirely, for sure. Right?
he's right. So he's going to say, well, every one of those choices that you make, even as you're constructing yourself in some kind of Sartrean sense in the process,
Mm-hmm.
nevertheless, those choices come about as a result of factors for which you're not ultimately responsible. But your point that you made a moment ago, I think, is a good one, which is that a good libertarian account of free will have baked in that there's a bunch of stuff already there that we don't have control over. So I do
Mm-hmm.
think that's it's something I'm actively thinking about. But yeah, one has to be careful in running the basic argument, as he calls it, not to sort of bake in to the idea of libertarianism stuff that no libertarian would put there, right?
Yeah,
Yeah,
totally right. And that's yeah, like I think there's lots of interesting. This is why I like the classical account of freedom of choice, right? Because I think
yeah,
it's appropriately restricted, right? It's appropriately restricted. It avoids there's lots of puzzles and paradoxes out there, right? And then the sort of metaphysics, which it's embedded in, is nice because I think it does a lot of other work elsewhere. And it does, I think, provide a good way to kind of tie it into more responsibility and the virtue ethics and stuff like that. But that's, that's a whole project, right? That's far beyond just like puzzles of free, and that's what makes philosophy tough, right? Because you kind of have to try to be systematic, and that's really hard to do because you don't always see how adjusting or committing to something in one area might affect or influence or contradict with commitments you hold in other areas, right?
I will. There are storms here, and my internet cut out for just a second, so I missed like the last 10 seconds of what you
Oh, it was
said.
all babble. Don't worry, it was nothing important.
I'm so sorry.
Yeah, I'm just saying I like the the classical view of libertarian physics because I think it's nice, appropriately restricted. It's got a kind of a nice wider metaphysical package that I think kind of helps things hang together. I was just talking about the importance of philosophers being systematic and the difficulty of that,
Yes.
right?
Yes.
Because it's not always immediately obvious how your
Yeah.
commitments or adjustments in one area radically influence or would alter or contradict with your commitments, or it's constantly like whack-a-mole, right? You close down on one thing here, something's going to pop up over there, right? Yeah.
And just to affirm that, yeah, no, I mean, I do now think that the ancients and the medievals were better situated, probably to tackle the free will slash agency question than contemporary philosophers are. Actually, I think that we begin philosophy now. Those of us who are just educated in kind of like mainstream analytic philosophy, I think we sort of begin with a metaphysics that makes it really hard to come up with a satisfactory account of free will.
Yeah.
But I didn't know much of anything. I'm ashamed to say about medieval philosophy in particular until I had a PhD, right? So maybe that's some kind of valuable lesson for people. Like it's very possible to get a PhD in philosophy and know basically nothing about what was happening in the medieval period, to know basically nothing about arguments for the existence of God. There's all sorts of stuff that just kind of like can fall by the wayside.
Yeah, there's a lot to be said about all that, but
Yes.
yeah, I'll refrain.
Yeah.
All right, arguments for God. Let's get into that now. This is something you now have put thought in. Maybe wasn't something that you seriously thought until after the PhD, but it's clearly something you're thinking a lot about now. You've got some really cool Substack, very helpful Substack entries on the topic right now. Where's your mind at? Yeah, awesome. Yeah, looking forward to that. So where's your mind at now with respect to natural theology? Because like you, this was something that I didn't encounter until I've said this before, so I don't want to rehearse it too much because my audience is probably bored to death. But like what got me out of naturalism was trying to go deeper into naturalism. It wasn't arguments for God, right? I didn't find this natural theology stuff till later. And then I was like, oh, this is kind of cool. And I think there's something here, right? And then I got really interested in it. Talk about it, your experience there, where your mind is at right now. Any arguments you're mulling over at present and all that stuff. Yeah.
Okay, yeah. Well, so first, we do seem to have followed pretty similar paths in this regard, as I've pointed out in the past in private correspondence. But yeah, I mean, I've listened to your story, a couple of renderings of it, and a lot of it really resonates with me. But yeah, okay. So, well, maybe I'll say this just to trigger some people. The ontological argument
Nice.
really captivated me. Going way back, honestly, going back to undergrad days. That was so I know, like in contemporary.
Sorry for the little technical hiccup. So I heard that the ontological argument originally fascinated you years and years ago. So pick it up from there again. Yeah.
Yeah. Apologies for my unstable internet here. So going back to undergrad days, I was always really captivated by that argument and was not at all persuaded that the supposedly decisive refutations that have been wheeled out, Galnillo's objection, the parody style objection, or the Kantian objection that no, existence is not a predicate. Those didn't ever really do it for me. So I always kind of had this lingering in the back of my mind.
So yeah, the Kantian objection, lots of objections not landing for you.
So yeah, the standard stock objections to the ontological argument didn't ever satisfy me. So I always kind of had that argument in the back of my mind. It ate at me, and then thinking about that argument sort of opened my mind to other arguments. And so, in particular, when I started teaching philosophy of religion, I really to trying to do justice to the contingency argument at length because I was super interested in it. The students seemed to be super interested in it. And we went deep, and I became convinced, this is about 2017, that really there's a very strong case to be made that there's some kind of necessary being that exists. And if you asked me today, I would still say that of the classical arguments for God, the contingency argument's the strongest.
Yeah.
Maybe I like the ontological argument still, and I'm happy to talk about it. Maybe its conclusion is too similar to one or more of its premises. That's maybe that's a kind of concern there. But the contingency argument's a different story. I really think that it some version of it works, honestly, and that once you start to analyze the concept of the necessary being, that's going to take you to something that's pretty godlike. And then from there, I was kind of off to the races because now I was like, okay, well, there actually is a good, respectable, historically grounded argument for God. Maybe there are other good arguments, and in fact, it would make sense that there were other good arguments for God if God exists, right? Like probably God's not going to like set things up so that you can only see that God exists by way of one argument. And so I went from there to fine tuning. I started to become convinced around 2020, 2021 that fine tuning argument also supplies very strong evidence. And there are a number of other kind of non-standard arguments, some that I think are not really original to me, perhaps, but that haven't received a lot of attention that I've been thinking about in the last year or two. So in short, I think there are probably like a couple of dozen really really good arguments for God. I would put the contingency argument at the top of the list, and I still have a special place in my heart for the ontological argument, even though people hate it. So
no, it's funny you say it's controversial that you're fascinated by it. I don't think that's. I mean, I think everybody is fascinated by the ontological argument. Like even skeptics should be fascinated by it, right? They're just the controversial, I guess, commitment would be whether you think there's a sound ontological argument or not. I've always, for a long time, I've kept saying, at some point I'm gonna go deeper in that direction. And of course, like I've tried to keep up with the big hitters on the topic and stuff like that. Don't have a settled mind on any particular version of the ontological argument. But contingency arguments, cosmological arguments in general, yeah, I'm with you. Those seem very strong to me, as I've mentioned many times on this podcast. You said some non-standard arguments. Yeah. Talk about those. That sounds interesting. I'm intrigued.
So first, just a kind of a general comment on what I'm calling non-standard. So by non-standard, I just mean like arguments that you haven't really seen defended in the history of philosophy by the great names, Leibniz, Aquinas.
Yeah, they weren't dealing with like these
Descartes.
Psychophysical harmony type argument stuff, right?
Yeah. But I think that what I think about this now is that for someone for whom the God question is seems hard to get a handle on because they're just like very far removed from theistic belief or religiosity in any way. I think that the non-standard arguments can kind of start to move such a person maybe more easily than Aquinas's 5 ways, or the ontological argument. Because for one thing, like to get into to really do justice to the 5 ways, you've got to do some heavy duty metaphysics. And it's easy to just kind of like Dawkins and the other new atheists do to it's very easy to misunderstand those arguments, to make caricatures of them and just dismiss them. What we can do is focus in on some features of experience that just seem, in a broadly Bayesian sense, best explained by the God hypothesis. Treating God as a hypothesis. So I think that can be a useful starting point, especially in a contemporary context. Okay, so what are some of them? Arguments from consciousness, I think, have a lot of force. There are
Mm.
a number of arguments kind of in that general territory, just from the datum itself. And a number of people have noted, it seems like you can get a pretty decent argument for God. And why? Well, consciousness exists. I, I, I do totally believe that, even though, in contemporary philosophy, there are people who deny it and then usually deny that they deny it. But anyway, that's its own can of worms. But,
Yeah, but once
it's
again,
like
a mark of significant progress. Yeah.
that's right. Yeah. Um, so it's like something to be you're conscious. But then if you reflect on this for a moment, you can, that's, even though it's the most familiar datum of experience, the fact that there is experience, that's like, you can wonder, well, why am I not just like a meat robot, or a philosophical zombie?
Hmm.
Why do I have an inner life at all? It seems like consciousness needs to be explained.
Hmm.
Maybe there's some respect in which consciousness cries out for explanation more than anything else, because it's the one thing, as I think Descartes recognized, that absolutely has to exist, right? It's the one thing of which you can be totally certain. So you better have some sort of account for it in your ontology.
Yeah, yeah.
Uh,
That there is awareness minimally, right? Like, please, don't try
yeah,
to get away from that one, right? Yeah.
And so, in a kind of standard naturalist ontology, what do you have at the fundamental level? I mean, you've got like, some particles and some laws. And kind of surprising that like particles and laws would produce what its likeness, that they would produce the redness of a red rose or the smell of garlic. Um, right. And
Yep.
whereas if you've got God at the foundation of things, what do you have? You have a conscious mind that's there from the beginning. So what's the probability of consciousness on theism? Well, one, because God exists, right?
Right.
Whereas if you're a naturalist, you can really wonder why there's consciousness in the first place.
Right.
So
And
yeah,
there's two, I think there's two problems there. I think first of all that seems right. It's like it's not there's the problem of how can it, right? How can you leap across that qualitative abyss of going from everything that getting everything that consciousness is, right? This qualitatively rich, subjective, deeply unified, teleological, what it is likeness, right? Getting that from everything that isn't that, right? That's kind of like the that's kind of David Bentley Hart just as a leap by magic, right? And I think that's
yeah,
and illustrations can help to bring the problem out. It's like complexity isn't the issue here. Time isn't the issue. Like it doesn't matter how many white Lego blocks you have. Doesn't matter how much time. You're not going to build a purple tower, right? It's just the categories here are just we're too radically different, right? It's not
yeah,
only how can it, but even if it could, why would it, right? So I get as people always will lecture at me when I state this with a million qualifications. Not every sort of naturalist is an epiphenomenalist. But dang, it's
oh
really
no,
hard. It's really
yeah,
hard to avoid
yeah, yeah,
epiphenomenalism, right? I haven't heard too many good stories of why you shouldn't be an epiphenomenalist. And if you are, then it's like, well, why? Like, even if you can get this epiphenomenal residue of this, what it is, like, it just makes no sense that it's even there because it's just causally irrelevant, right? So I think the problems only compound like when you go deeper into it. And then the God point's good, right? I mean, like you just have consciousness baked in right at the beginning, but then also, the traditional theist story of God creating and goodness self-diffusive, a great chain of being would lead you to anticipate other beings, I think, like us, other conscious beings, stuff like that. So just in terms of, broad degree of expectation, I think you're right. I mean, obviously there's many details and lots of ways the debate could go. Um, but yeah, I think that's right. So yeah, back to you on all that. Mhm.
there's a kind of richness, I think, to the theistic explanation here that I think you won't find on a naturalistic one. So like, I mean, I'm happy. I think uh, naturalists naturalists obviously should affirm the existence of consciousness, and they've got options, right? So one is to do what my old mentor and friend Galen does, which is to endorse panpsychism. It's
Yeah,
just
be a panpsychist. Mhm.
you can be a panpsychist. You can say that matter itself is experiential, so that's an option. You could say that you could be a dualist, and a naturalist. Chalmers flirts at least with the kind of naturalistic dualism that's not epiphenomenalist in the conscious mind, right? And
Yep.
I don't know what his views are these days, but like that's a view that's out there in conceptual space. Here's the issue that, so I think that for the naturalistic dualist, here's the real issue that I see. They just have to posit that you have all these psychophysical laws, that like pair certain physical goings on with certain mental goings on, and then you ask, well, why do those laws obtain? And they'll say, well, don't ask that question, right? Like that's they have to, or they just do. Those are the two options basically. They're either like brute necessities or they're brute contingencies, and that doesn't seem terribly satisfying. Whereas if you've got God in the picture, you can say, well, God would want there to be such a pairing between physical and mental states, right? So the explanation seems to go deeper. I've been thinking about what the theistic reply should be to the panpsychist. I mean, I think that there is something that's attractive about the panpsychist position, but one thought that I that I've tossed out there at least is that maybe actually if panpsychism is true, that's maybe a point in favor of theism. And why? Well, because consciousness has value. And if it turns out that matter itself is intrinsically valuable, maybe that's more expected on theism than it is on atheism. But I think that ultimately, I'm not super happy with panpsychism because I think that there's a kind of emergence problem even on panpsychism, where
Yep.
you have to explain the emergence of agents like you and me from a bunch of little micro particles that have their own brand of phenomenology, and it's very hard to see how that goes. So if it's some level you end up with some sort of dualism, however you cash that out, I think that's a pretty strong mark in favor of theism.
I agree. I think there's lots of problems with panpsychism, not just binding problem issues and stuff like that, which I agree with. Those are real issues. I also think that, as hard as the hard problem of consciousness is, I think that there's even more convincing arguments against naturalists broadly from philosophy of mind, particularly with respect to just the immateriality, universality of thought, rationality, stuff like that, right? Panpsychism is not going to help with that, I don't think.
I think that's
but
right.
but that said, like, as soon as, like, to me, like, if you're going to be a panpsychist, you might as well be a theist, or at least, like, I don't think you should be a committed naturalist anymore, because again, this comes back to the systems point. Like, why is somebody a naturalist in the first place? Well, presumably, not always, but oftentimes a lot explicitly, they think that, like, you can explain everything through, like, an idealized completed physics, right? It's as broad scientism. And there's but as soon as you're a panpsychist, you're no longer committed to that, right?
That's right.
So now you've sort of given up, to me, what is the inner logic and kind of underlying motivation behind a lot of naturalism. So you should just be like totally open to natural theology and all sorts of stuff at that point.
This is go ahead. Sorry.
No, they're like that, and I anticipate 10 different counters to that, but like that's a point that I think at least needs to be acknowledged, right? Like, sure, there's no, like, I'm not going to come and say you can't be a panpsychist if you're a naturalist. I'm just saying, when we think about it in terms of systems and motivations and epistemology, right, and how epistemology constrains ontology, as soon as you make these moves to dualism or panpsychism as a naturalist, you're breaking with a lot of that inner logic, I think. Right.
So I'm so glad this came up, because I think that's right. I think that, like, if I were to take on the task today of defending naturalism, what I would do is just defend a version of naturalism that makes the natural world much more godlike, right? And so there's a really good book co-authored. It's a kind of debate book. You might have read it. Features my friend Josh Rasmussen.
And Felipe Leon.
Who's
God, the best
an amazing
explanation of things.
And Josh is a fantastic resource who's been really helpful to me over the years. But so he and Felipe Leon had this back and forth, and I think that book is really interesting, because what happens is that what Felipe ends up doing is just defending naturalism by way of making the universe seem very godlike, right? So he's
It's
just like,
very magical, right? And not in a bad
yeah,
way. Like
yeah,
I think the universe is magical, right?
yeah,
But
yeah,
I
yeah,
think that
yeah,
like if you're a theist, that's cool. Yeah, you're right. Like so these more kind of like liberal or exotic forms of naturalism are becoming increasingly popular.
yep.
And to me, like that's just a concession as far as I'm concerned,
I
right?
agree. I think that's a
Mhm.
big mark in favor of theism, that there's
Yeah.
this pressure, that naturalists themselves, like very thoughtful naturalists themselves, feel to make their own worldview more like theism. Because just reporting autobiographically, and I think based on things I've heard you say, you would resonate with this.
Mhm.
But when I was a committed naturalist, I mean, I thought basically I needed to be a either a reductive materialist or an eliminative materialist. So I was like, okay, yeah, there's no there's no intrinsic value, no consciousness, no teleology, no
Yeah.
no normativity. Like that's all got to go.
That's all bunk.
Math
Yeah.
and logic, that's got to be accounted for in non-ontological terms. And I do think that there's a good reason to have that thought, which is that, well, like what got us going in that direction in the first place was the thought that, oh, like, science is really how we figure stuff out. And so we're just going to extract from our ontology, all the stuff that's not, like posited explicitly in our best scientific theories.
Mhm.
And once you get very far away from that, it just becomes less and less clear the sense in which your worldview is any longer naturalistic.
Yes, I agree. And then it becomes, I think, a fairly arbitrary stopping point. Like, because once you've freed yourself of those, call it the science, the constraints of scientism, really. And I don't mean that
Yeah.
as a pejorative. I think that there's actually like there's like if I was to say something in favor of naturalism, it'd be in that direction, right? But once you've freed
Yeah.
yourself of that, and you start just like stuffing all this stuff back into your ontology that like you're pulling out of the theist pantry, right, but then you lack that ultimate principle of unity and
That's the thing.
explanation. For
Yeah.
me, for my mind, like I could never make that arbitrary cutoff. Like, and why? And here's the question: why would you? And the only thing I
Yeah.
can think of at that point is either two things: one charitable, one not. The not
Yeah.
charitable thing is you just got some bias, right? The
Uh-huh.
charitable thing is like you really grapple with the problem of evil, right? And then it
Hmm.
comes down to like
Yeah.
one
Yeah.
of those, and maybe it's both, and maybe it's
Yeah.
both. But even for me, like, oh yeah, problem of evil, hard. I've thought about that a lot, but
Agreed. Yeah, for sure.
even
Yeah.
yeah, for sure, willing to grant that that's a serious thing that any theist has to grapple with. I don't see that actually being dealt with better at all adequately by the sort of non-classical theist perspective. And I think there's at least some stories that can be told from classical theism that can help with this, right? Certainly made my attempt in print in lots of places if people are interested. And then you get all the theoretical explanatory unifying benefits of classical theism on top of it. So just for me personally, that's why I could never, like, if I'm going to be if I was going to be, even entertain liberal naturalism, I couldn't stop short of traditional theism, right? Mm-hmm.
Yep. Yep. And yeah, and I think, and I imagine we're of the same mind about this. But yeah, you mentioned the problem of evil. I'm surprised that I haven't mentioned the problem of evil up to this point. I mean, that was certainly one of the things that held me back for a long time. And I think that if you had asked my graduate school self at almost any phase, I would have said, well, like whatever considerations are that count in favor of God, they're just pretty much overwhelmed by the evidential argument from evil. I just don't think
Yeah.
there's any kind of response to that. Especially, I long thought that the problem of animal suffering, and especially like evolutionary animal suffering, is just fantastically hard to deal with. Didn't see how it could be done. And then eventually what happened, and I think this is really like within the last couple of years, maybe the last year, honestly,
Mm-hmm.
that this has become clear in my mind. There was just a kind of uh, flip where I started to think that really, um, on on a naturalist ontology, it's surprising that the conditions for evil would be in place in the first place, right? Because if again, like you tell me that at the bottom of things, you've got some particles and you've got some laws, and somehow they're connected, and that's like its own problem. But um, I'm not going to predict that those particles and laws are going to spit out where a bunch of conscious creatures that can suffer. In fact, they're probably not, according to the fine-tuning type argument, they're probably not even going to shoot out a universe in which life can emerge in the first place. And so I think that, that ultimately the problem of evil arises because you've got a bunch of conditions in place that are not well accounted for on an atheistic worldview. So atheism, I think, does much better explain why there's such awful stuff in reality. Why is there all this misery? And there is a whole lot of misery. Well, because you live in a cold and different universe. I mean, duh, that's why. Okay, so cool. Good. There's good explanatory value there. But only after you've got a whole bunch of stuff. Fine-tuning, consciousness, psychophysical harmony, something rather than nothing, that is not predicted. That is not predicted by atheism.
And that for you is just push the scales back in the.
That's right. So I think that now, even if I say that, even if I grant that, evil is some evidence, maybe even some pretty strong evidence against theism, it's overwhelmed by all the considerations for theism.
Yeah, and that's a very fair position. I want to say I think it's right, but at the same time, I think my mind is like even a bit stronger these days, right? Because you're right? Is like you're not saying that you aren't saying that evil or suffering itself, and we can make a distinction between those because you just focus on suffering, right, without making any moral judgments about it, right, is evidence for seeing theism. You're saying there's a whole lot of just logically prior hurdles that would have to be cleared to even get to the point where that's a real possibility. And all those hurdles seem to only be cleared by a theistic worldview or significantly favor a theistic worldview, that even if I grant that the distribution patterns of suffering count towards naturals, and the scales are so heavily pinned down already that I'll make the, and that's just where I land, right?
Yeah.
My current thought is that there is an assessment. So you mentioned animal suffering. I'll just give a plug. I won't get into it now. But there is an assessment. There's a new volume out from Rutledge, which I contributed to. It's got the most obnoxious title you've ever heard. It's like the something companion to animal suffering in the philosophy of religion, blah, blah, blah. Right. I'll link it. So I contributed to it. And I want to say, even after you move all that stuff into like your background knowledge, we could still make a case that because the non-theistic accounts here are so poor, it's sort of a modest case, right? They are so poor when you get into the real relevant details of it, that as long as a theist has some story with a little bit of plausibility, they can even edge that out. I don't think, to your point, I don't think that like the theist needs to go that far, but it's just like somebody who's thought about this for a long time. It's kind of funny because sometimes like you start out stronger, become more modest in positions. I found myself actually becoming like a little bit more aggressive, like on it, right? And not like intentionally apologetically. So just the more I've thought about it, but people can check out that volume if they want. It's only like $179 on
Amazon. I need to go read your contribution to that. Thanks for letting me know.
Yeah. Yeah, this has been a lot of fun so far. Is there anything else we haven't hit that you wanted to jam around on here? Because
well, I can think of one thing that ties into a couple of the topics that we've discussed. So speaking of non-standard arguments for God, there's an argument that I really haven't seen developed. I mean, I'm nothing is original in philosophy, so I'm sure that somebody else has talked about it. But in my Substack post on 15 arguments, for the existence of God, I talked towards the end about an argument from free will, which I think just from freedom, which might seem ironic given the skeptical noises that I've made about free will.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
But here's the thought, and I absolutely plan to develop this at more length. Maybe I'll even try to scrap out a respectable publication, of which I have far too few. But so the thought is that the fact that there's any kind of agential freedom at all, so we can ditch, the full-fledged ultimate moral responsibility entailing version of free will. Just the fact that there is some obvious sense in which, like you and I act freely, like our actions flow from us, from our decisions, from our agency in some kind of tight way, such that our own actions are not mysterious to us. That's actually kind of surprising on atheism, right? So you can imagine things unfolding in such a way that experientially that's not how things are for us at all. Like, so like it could be the case that phenomenologically, I don't experience harmony between like what I'm intending and what I do.
Yeah, right, totally.
Right. But as long as thinking about this from a naturalistic evolutionary perspective, as long as I'm acting in broadly adaptive ways, that are not going to undercut my survival and reproduction, then I'll pass on whatever those genes are that involve this kind of disharmony between intentions and actions. So the fact that we experience ourselves as acting freely itself kind of cries out for explanation. It is nicely explained by theism. And why? Well, again, you can supply all sorts of reasons why God would want to have creatures that are in some respects causally, agentially responsible for their actions.
Right.
Whereas there's no prior expectation of that on atheistic worldviews. So I think that whatever kind of freedom we have, even if it's hyper minimalistic, even if it's the freedom of the turnspit that the compatibilists describe, that's some evidence for theism.
Yeah, I like that. I agree too, and I just think the notion of, again, it comes back to this is the last point I'll make, but I always like to remind people it's not like the typical classical theist and the typical naturalist. Like, they see the world pretty much the same way. It's just one posits this extra thing and the other like doesn't. It's so not like, man, it's so different. I mean, for the classical theists, like, what are the primary substances? Well, it's people, like literally at the very bottom, people, right? Believe God as a person, analogically, but even us, right? We are in a sense are fundamental insofar as if we follow Aristotle, right? We're a primary substance with a kind of suite of systems level irreducible powers that are not reducible just to our smaller physical bits, right? So like the whole ontology is just very, very different, right? And I think that ontology is a really good one because I think it's like super explanatory for a host of issues, including matters related to free will and agency and immorality as well, which we didn't even get into. I think it's super relevant there. And then once you have that ontology and you kind of search around for the necessary conditions for it, those are your traditional, proofs, if you want to call them that, for God. And what's the point of all that? I think sometimes those differences can get overlooked when somebody just thinks in terms of the worldview hypothesis testing, which I think is a great methodology. I endorse it in my book. I just like to emphasize like how different the conceptions of reality really are between theists and naturalists. Most of the time, once you have these more exotic forms of naturalists, you start to have more points of convergence. And I don't know if there's any further point to it than that. But like for me, when I'm trying to make, and I'm sure this is the case for you too, like when I'm trying to like make sense of like things of like freedom of the will and the moral domain, and rationality, like I'm generally not immediately looking to God, right? I'm trying to find a general like metaphysic or philosophy of nature that is consistent, at least consistent with what we know through contemporary science, doesn't like contradict anything that's uncontestable. And then it's that, right, that I think is either like will necessitate a classical theism, or is like better anticipated by theism. I don't know. Maybe you have a few thoughts on all that, or maybe even just like how your own kind of commitments at that more, at the level of philosophy of nature, metaphysics have shifted as you've changed like your commitment at the fundamental level, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Okay. So, one comment there is that, yeah, I think that the kind of probabilistic worldview testing and comparison method is a really good starting point, and it's a sort of way in. And
Yeah.
I'm really interested in that because, like I was sort of like wandering in darkness for a long time, very, very confused about these questions, and sympathetic to people who are in that condition. And I think that, that way of thinking is more accessible to someone who's there. Now, once you're not there, and like once you become quite committed to a theistic worldview, then yeah, I think there's some sense in which, at least at a personal level, you maybe graduate beyond that, and you just kind of like, you've got your own system, and you start just working out all the implications and entailments of that system. But yeah, I think there's a lot to be said for, especially in the current environment, being open to, starting off treating God as a kind of hypothesis. Even though I know, like, a lot of Thomists in particular really hate that way of thinking about things, there's a lot of value in it.
I agree with both points. One, a lot of Thomists do hate that. I'm
Yes,
pretty
yeah.
Thomisty, but I don't hate it. So, because I think there's
Which
value
I
in it. So,
appreciate about you. Yeah. That's right. Yeah, no, that's right. And another thought that I have is that if you're somebody who, like me, keeps asking why, right, and you're not happy with arbitrary stopping points, it's going to be hard not to get to something quite godlike at the foundation of things, because God's like the ultimate question stopper. It's hard to see how there's any other sort of entity apart from God, with respect to which it doesn't make sense to ask, why this or that about that entity in some way. Whereas, like plausibly, if you understand what God is, then you understand that explanation does kind of bottom out with God, at some level. So yeah.
Yeah. Great. JP, where can people keep up with you? Substack, mention your Substack. You're pretty active on Twitter. God love you for that. Somebody's got to do that. So.
I would say I'll plug the Substack rather than the Twitter. But yes, people should, if you follow me on Substack, please. I've been busy getting ready to teach, for the upcoming year, so I've been a little bit behind. But I have a lot of posts that I'm planning to roll out there in the future, and yeah, that would be the primary place to find, the best version of my thoughts, which is what people should be after. My refined thoughts as they are. I
Excellent.
also have a YouTube channel, that currently has only 2 interviews, but there's one with Galen Strawson,
Yeah,
actually, that
very
people
cool.
might be interested in, since I keep referring to him. I love Galen, even, like, we disagree about a lot of these questions at this point, but he's so great.
Yeah.
And I think that was a fun conversation. And I plan to put more stuff up there. I'm trying to kind of launch that channel.
Yeah, awesome. Well, go help them out, gentle listeners. Subscribe to the YouTube channel, subscribe to the Substack, and JP, let's make sure we do this again. This has been a lot of fun.